The night of the engagement party, I stood in the center of my living room watching champagne glasses clink around me, and all I could hear was her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. "Come on, Turtle, you can do this." She said it with this mock-sweet tone, like she was coaching a toddler to tie their shoes, and everyone laughed. Even my son. Especially my son. That's the moment I knew I'd lost him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back 3 months, to when I still believed love was enough to hold a family together. I live in Phoenix, in a quiet neighborhood where the houses have terracotta roofs and the desert heat makes everything shimmer in the afternoons. My name is Linda, and for 37 years, I built my life around being a mother. My husband died when our son Marcus was 12, and after that, it was just the two of us. I worked 2 jobs to put him through college, skipped vacations so he could have the best opportunities, and told myself every sacrifice was an investment in our bond. When he brought Vanessa home for the first time, I tried so hard to see what he saw in her. She was sharp, confident, the kind of woman who walked into a room and commanded attention. I wanted to like her. I really did. But there was something in the way she looked at me, like I was furniture she was mentally rearranging. I remember that first dinner vividly. I'd spent hours preparing Marcus's favorite meal, the pot roast I'd made for every birthday since he was 7. The kitchen still smelled of rosemary and garlic when they arrived. Vanessa walked in wearing white linen, pristine and perfect, and I immediately felt self-conscious about the flour dusting my apron. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said something about how quaint my house was. Quaint, like I was a museum exhibit. During dinner, I asked her about her work in marketing, genuinely interested. But she kept redirecting the conversation to Marcus's achievements, things I already knew because I'd been there for every step. I caught her checking her phone twice under the table. When I brought out the chocolate cake I'd baked that morning, she touched Marcus's arm and said, "We really shouldn't, babe. Remember we're doing that cleanse?" He'd never mentioned a cleanse to me. He put down his fork and nodded, leaving half the slice I'd cut for him untouched. That small gesture, that immediate deference to her preferences over our tradition, that was the first warning sign I chose to ignore. Over the next few weeks, I noticed other changes. Marcus started using words he'd never used before, corporate jargon that sounded foreign coming from the boy who'd once communicated primarily in basketball stats and movie quotes. He stopped calling me just to check in, only reaching out when Vanessa had something to share, an announcement about their relationship timeline or a request for family photos she needed for some project. I told myself this was normal, that adult children grow up and grow apart. But deep down, I knew something was shifting, and I wasn't being given a map to navigate the new terrain. The nickname started as a joke. We were at a family barbecue, and I was taking my time getting out of my lawn chair because my hip had been bothering me. Vanessa laughed and said, "Come on, Turtle, the food's getting cold." Marcus grinned. His aunt chuckled. And just like that, I became Turtle. At first, I laughed along because what else could I do? But then it stuck. Every family gathering, every phone call, it was always Turtle this, Turtle that. The endearment curdled into something else, something that made me feel small and slow and irrelevant. And Marcus never stopped her. Not once. I'd catch his eye across the room, silently begging him to defend me, but he'd just shrug or change the subject. That's when the first crack appeared, hairline thin but undeniable. The woman I raised to stand up for what's right couldn't stand up for his own mother. What hurt most wasn't the nickname itself, it was how it spread. Vanessa used it so casually that soon Marcus's college friends picked it up. Then, distant relatives I only saw at holidays. I became a punchline in my own family story. At my niece's graduation party, I overheard 2 of Vanessa's friends talking near the buffet table. One of them said, "Is that Turtle?" Oh my God, she's exactly how Vanessa described her. They laughed, not meanly exactly, but with that dismissive amusement reserved for people who don't quite matter. I stood there holding my paper plate of potato salad, frozen, pretending I hadn't heard. But I had. And it burrowed deep into my chest, making a home next to all the other hurts I was collecting, like stones in my pockets. I kept telling myself it was wedding stress. Planning a big event makes everyone tense, right? So I swallowed my hurt and threw myself into helping. I offered to pay for the flowers, volunteered to address invitations, suggested we use my grandmother's lace for her veil. Every offer was met with the same response. "Oh, that's so sweet, Turtle, but we've got it covered." Or worse, "We're going for something more modern, you know?" The implication hung in the air like smoke. I was old-fashioned, out of touch, in the way. I started to wonder if maybe she was right. Maybe I was meddling. Maybe I needed to step back and let them build their life without my interference. So I did. I stopped calling as much, stopped dropping by with leftovers, stopped offering advice unless directly asked, which happened less and less. But stepping back didn't earn me the respect I'd hoped for. Instead, it created more distance. When I did call, Marcus's responses got shorter, more distracted. "Yeah, Mom, sounds good. Listen, we're actually in the middle of something. Can I call you back?" He never did. When I sent care packages, homemade cookies, and the wool socks he'd always loved for winter, they went unacknowledged for weeks. Then I'd get a brief text. "Thanks for the stuff." Vanessa's trying to get me to eat healthier, though. No mention of whether he'd enjoyed them, whether they'd reminded him of all those Saturday mornings we'd spent baking together when he was young. It was like our shared history was being slowly erased, replaced with a new narrative where I was an outdated supporting character instead of a central figure. The weird thing about being pushed aside is how slowly it happens. It's not one big shove. It's 1,000 tiny steps backward until you realize you're standing in a different room entirely. I used to have coffee every week with my friend group, women I'd known for decades, but gradually I started canceling. Marcus might need me, I'd say, or I should be available in case they want help with the wedding. One by one, those friendships grew distant. My social circle shrank to the size of my son's life, and his life was increasingly occupied by Vanessa. I told myself I was being a good mother, prioritizing family, making space for the next generation. But really, I was erasing myself, giving up pieces of who I was in exchange for the promise that my sacrifices would be rewarded with love and closeness. That's the belief that kept me trapped, the one I couldn't shake no matter how much evidence piled up against it. I thought if I just gave enough, proved my worth enough, they'd see how much I mattered. There was this one Thursday afternoon when I realized how far I'd fallen. My friend Barbara called to invite me to her daughter's art show opening. Barbara and I had been friends since our kids were in preschool together. We'd survived PTA meetings and science fair disasters and teenage rebellions side by side. But I'd canceled on her last 3 invitations, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice when she asked, like she wasn't sure I'd even want to come anymore. I almost said yes. The word was right there on my tongue. But then I thought, what if Marcus calls? What if he needs something and I'm not available? What if this is the one time he reaches out and I miss it? So I made another excuse, something vague about not feeling well. Barbara was quiet for a moment, then said, "Linda, honey, you know you can't live your whole life waiting by the phone, right?" I laughed it off, told her I wasn't, told her I'd make the next one for sure. But after I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and looked at my phone, at the silent screen that had become the center of my universe. And I cried. Because she was right, and I knew it. But I didn't know how to stop. The engagement party was Vanessa's idea, of course. A big celebration at my house, because it had the best backyard, she said. I spent days cleaning, cooking, stringing lights across the patio. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted her to see that I could be useful, that I belonged in this new chapter of their lives. The morning of the party, I woke up at 5 a.m., too anxious to sleep. I made 3 different appetizers from scratch, picked flowers from my garden for the centerpieces, ironed the tablecloths twice because the first attempt left a crease I didn't like. My hip was already aching by noon, but I pushed through it. This was important. This was my chance to prove that I still mattered, that I could still contribute something valuable to their lives. Vanessa arrived 3 hours before the guests, ostensibly to help, but really to rearrange everything I'd set up. She moved the centerpieces, claiming they blocked sightlines for conversation. She replaced my homemade appetizers with catered trays she'd ordered, saying she wanted to make sure there was enough food, though we both knew it was because she didn't trust my cooking. She even changed the music I'd selected, switching from the jazz standards I loved to some electronic playlist that made my teeth hurt. I stood in my own kitchen, feeling like a stranger, watching her orchestrate my space. Marcus hovered nearby, telling me how great everything looked, how grateful they were to use the house. But he never once questioned Vanessa's changes, never once suggested that maybe, since it was my home, my preferences should carry some weight. He'd brought her into our family, but in doing so, he'd subtly rewritten the hierarchy. And I was no longer at the top. The night of the party, I was carrying a tray of appetizers from the kitchen when my hip locked up. It does that sometimes, a reminder that I'm not as young as I used to be. I paused, steadying myself against the doorframe, and that's when Vanessa's voice rang out across the yard. "Come on, Turtle, you can do this." The whole crowd turned to look at me. Her friends, Marcus's college buddies, our relatives, everyone. And they laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind that makes you the punchline without your consent. I forced a smile, carried the tray to the table, and felt something inside me crack wide open. I remember every detail of that moment with brutal clarity. The weight of the tray in my hands, the way the porch light cast long shadows across the yard, the smell of citronella candles mixing with expensive perfume. I remember the exact pitch of Vanessa's laughter, bright and performative, designed to draw everyone's attention. I remember scanning the crowd for a sympathetic face and finding none. They were all entertained, charmed even, by her playful mockery. And I remember looking at Marcus, really looking at him, and seeing him laugh along with everyone else. Not a polite chuckle, a real laugh. Like watching his mother struggle and be humiliated was genuinely amusing to him. That image is burned into my brain. My son, the person I'd sacrificed everything for, finding joy in my pain. Marcus was standing right there. He heard her. He saw my face, and he said nothing. Just took a spring roll off the tray and turned back to his conversation. That silence was louder than any insult Vanessa could have thrown at me. It told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in his priorities. After the guests left and the yard was littered with empty glasses and crumpled napkins, I sat alone on the patio and let myself feel the full weight of it. My son, the boy I'd raised to be kind and loyal, had chosen her mockery over my dignity. And I'd let it happen because I was too afraid of losing him to set boundaries. I stayed out there until past midnight, wrapped in a blanket, watching the string lights sway in the desert breeze. I replayed every moment of the party, torturing myself with all the things I should have said, the ways I could have responded. But the truth was, I'd been so conditioned to shrink myself, to accommodate, to keep the peace, that standing up for myself felt impossible. Foreign, like trying to speak a language I'd never learned. I thought about my husband, about what he would have said if he could see how Marcus treated me now. He'd raised our son to respect women, to value family, to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. When had Marcus forgotten those lessons? Or had he simply decided they didn't apply to me? I know you're probably yelling at your screen right now, telling me I should have said something sooner. Believe me, I've asked myself that same question 1,000 times. But here's the thing about love. It doesn't make you blind. It paralyzes you. You see the red flags waving, but you convince yourself they're just decorative banners. You feel the knife twisting, but you tell yourself it's just a little scratch. Because admitting the truth means facing a reality you're not ready to accept. And I wasn't ready. Not yet. The weeks after the engagement party were a blur of forced normalcy. I went through the motions, smiling at their wedding updates, nodding along to Vanessa's plans. But inside, I was cataloging every slight, every dismissive comment. Every moment Marcus chose her comfort over my feelings. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before, noticing how she'd interrupt me mid-sentence, or how she'd make decisions about the wedding without consulting me, even when it involved my family traditions. There was a pattern there, deliberate and calculated. She wasn't just being thoughtless. She was systematically reducing my role, making sure everyone knew who was really in charge. I thought about calling Marcus, sitting him down for a real conversation. But every time I picked up the phone, I'd remember that silence at the party and put it back down. What was the point? He'd made his choice clear. So instead, I pulled further into myself, stopped going to church because I couldn't face the questions about the wedding, stopped answering calls from old friends because I didn't want to explain why I felt so alone. My world got smaller and smaller until it was just me and my thoughts spiraling in the quiet of my house. And that's where I stayed, trapped in the belief that if I just waited long enough, loved hard enough, sacrificed completely enough, my son would wake up and remember who I was to him. Looking back now, I can see how dangerous that isolation was. But at the time, it felt like the only option I had, because the alternative, acknowledging that my son might not love me the way I loved him, was too painful to face. So I held on to my delusion and waited for a miracle that wasn't coming. The dinner party wasn't supposed to change anything. It was just another obligation. Another evening of playing nice while Vanessa orchestrated the conversation and Marcus nodded along. They'd invited some of their friends over, young professionals with designer jeans and opinions about everything. I was there because I'd made a casserole, and Vanessa had insisted I stay, though I suspect it was more about not wasting the food than actually wanting my company. We were sitting around my dining table, the one my husband built by hand 40 years ago, and someone asked Vanessa how she was handling the stress of wedding planning. She laughed, that tinkling sound that always set my teeth on edge, and said, "Oh, it's been such a journey, especially navigating all the old-fashioned expectations." She glanced at me, and I knew what was coming. Like, Marcus's mom had all these ideas about traditions and lace and things that worked in, a different era. But we've really modernized everything, made it our own. The table erupted in knowing chuckles. One of her friends added something about respecting the past while moving forward, and Vanessa beamed like she'd just delivered a TED Talk. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth, feeling my face go hot. Not from embarrassment, from rage. Because in that moment, I saw it all clearly. Every comment, every joke, every time she'd brushed off my input. It wasn't accidental. It was a campaign. She was rewriting the narrative of our family, and I was being edited out. The friend who'd spoken up, a woman named Kristen with severely cut bangs and an MBA she'd mentioned 3 times in the first hour, leaned forward conspiratorially. "I think it's so brave of you, Vanessa, to set those boundaries. So many women let their mothers-in-law run the whole show." She said mothers-in-law like it was a diagnosis, an affliction to be managed. The others nodded, murmuring agreement, and I realized they'd had this conversation before. Behind my back, Vanessa had been painting me as the overbearing matriarch, the obstacle to their modern, enlightened union. And they'd all bought it without question, without ever meeting me or hearing my side. I was a caricature to them, a stand-in for every difficult older woman they'd ever encountered. Not a real person. Certainly not someone worthy of respect or empathy. Marcus sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee, and he didn't say a word, didn't correct her, didn't defend me, just smiled and took another bite of my casserole like I hadn't just been publicly humiliated in my own home. That's when I understood that his silence wasn't passive. It was complicity. He was choosing this. Choosing her version of the story where I was the outdated obstacle they'd heroically overcome. And the worst part, the part that made my hands shake as I set down my fork, was that everyone at that table believed it. They saw me exactly the way Vanessa wanted them to see me, as a relic, a well-meaning but ultimately irrelevant figure from a bygone time. I excused myself to the kitchen, and nobody noticed. They were too busy laughing at some inside joke I wasn't part of. I stood at the sink, gripping the edge of the counter, and forced myself to breathe. This was the collapse. The moment when all the pretty lies I'd been telling myself shattered. My son wasn't going to wake up and defend me. This wasn't a phase or wedding stress or a misunderstanding. This was who he'd chosen to be. And if I didn't do something, if I didn't find a way to reclaim my dignity, I was going to disappear entirely. That realization was both terrifying and clarifying. Because once you stop expecting someone to save you, you can start saving yourself. I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, backlit by the overhead light, and barely recognized the woman looking back at me. When had I become so diminished? So willing to accept crumbs of affection and call it a feast? My mother hadn't raised me to be a doormat. My husband hadn't loved a woman who disappeared at the first sign of conflict. Somewhere along the way, in my desperation to hold on to Marcus, I'd lost Linda. And standing there in my own kitchen, listening to strangers mock me in my own dining room, I decided I wanted her back. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living like this, shrinking and shrinking until there was nothing left but a nickname and a pile of ignored sacrifices. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I made coffee, sat on my back patio, and let myself feel everything I'd been suppressing. The anger, the grief, the bone-deep loneliness. And then I called Carol. She lived 3 houses down, a retired teacher with a no-nonsense attitude and a talent for cutting through emotional fog. We'd been neighbors for 15 years, sharing coffee and complaints about everything from property taxes to the heat. But somewhere along the way, I'd let that friendship lapse, too busy orbiting Marcus and Vanessa to make time for my own life. Carol answered on the second ring, and before I could second-guess myself, I told her everything. The nickname, the dinner party, the systematic erasure. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Linda, you've been so busy being a good mother that you forgot to be a whole person. And honey, they're counting on that." Carol came over within the hour, still in her gardening clothes, smelling of soil and sunscreen. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug, the kind of solid, no-nonsense embrace that made it safe to fall apart. I cried on her shoulder, really cried, for the first time since all of this started. When I finally pulled back, she sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Okay, tell me everything. Not the sanitized version you've been telling yourself. The real version." So I did. I told her about the first dinner with Vanessa and the white linen and the untouched cake. I told her about the nickname spreading like wildfire through my family. I told her about the engagement party and Marcus's laughter and the way I'd felt invisible in my own home. And I told her about the dinner party, about being mocked at my own table while eating food I'd made with my own hands. Carol listened, her expression growing darker with each revelation. And when I finished, she said one word: enough. She came over that afternoon with a notebook and a plan. Carol had a way of seeing problems as puzzles to be solved, and she approached my situation with the same practical energy she'd once used to manage unruly classrooms. "First," she said, "we need to understand what you have that they want." I blinked at her, confused. She tapped her pen on the table. "You've been funding a lot of this wedding, haven't you? Helping with bills? Covering expenses?" I nodded slowly. Carol smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Then we cut them off. You reclaim your financial power. Show them that you're not just an ATM with outdated opinions." It felt radical, cruel even. But as we went through my bank statements, highlighting every payment I'd made on their behalf, I realized she was right. I'd been using money to buy their affection, and it wasn't working. All it had done was teach them that I was a resource to be managed, not a person to be respected. We spent 3 hours that afternoon going through everything. The credit card charges, the Venmo transfers, the checks I'd written for things like Marcus's car insurance and half their rent. I hadn't even realized how much I'd been giving until I saw it all laid out in black and white. Thousands and thousands of dollars, spent with the unconscious belief that financial support would translate to emotional connection. Carol pointed out a particularly large transfer from 2 months ago. "What's this?" she asked. I felt my face flush. Vanessa wanted a specific photographer for the wedding. They were outside the budget, so I covered the difference. Carol's jaw tightened. "And did she thank you?" I thought back. Vanessa had sent a text. "Cool, thanks." 2 words. Carol closed the notebook. "We're done. You're done. You don't owe them another cent." Over the next week, Carol and I restructured my finances. I set up a separate account for my pension, one they couldn't access. I canceled the credit card I'd given Marcus for emergencies, the one Vanessa had been using for wedding expenses. I transferred my savings into a trust with strict conditions. It wasn't about punishing them, not really. It was about protecting myself, about drawing a line that said, "I matter, and you can't take that for granted anymore." The first time Marcus called asking why the card was declined, I felt my stomach drop. But Carol was sitting right beside me, and she squeezed my hand. "You've got this, Turtle," she whispered, reclaiming the nickname with affection instead of mockery. I told Marcus we needed to talk in person. His voice got tight, defensive, but he agreed. Carol also helped me see that this wasn't just about Marcus and Vanessa. It was about a pattern I'd fallen into, sacrificing my own needs and identity in the name of family harmony. She reminded me of all the friendships I'd neglected, the hobbies I'd abandoned, the parts of myself I'd packed away like old clothes I thought I'd never wear again. "We need to rebuild you," she said, not just as Marcus's mom, as Linda, a person with interests and friends and a life that doesn't revolve around someone else's approval. It sounded impossible. I'd spent so long defining myself through my role as a mother that I didn't know who Linda was anymore. But Carol was patient. She dragged me to community events, introduced me to her book club, made sure I had reasons to leave the house that had nothing to do with my son. Slowly, painfully, I started to remember what it felt like to exist outside of his orbit. The book club was the first place I started to feel like myself again. It met every other Tuesday at the community center, a group of 8 women ranging from their 50s to their 80s. They were reading a mystery novel when I first joined, something about a detective in Scotland, and I'd barely cracked the spine. But they welcomed me anyway, poured me tea, and didn't ask prying questions about why I'd been absent from neighborhood life for so long. We talked about the book, about the weather, about a controversial new stop sign the city had installed. Normal things, easy things, things that had nothing to do with weddings or nicknames or sons who'd forgotten their mothers. And for 2 hours every other Tuesday, I remembered what it felt like to just be Linda. Not Turtle, not Marcus's mom, just me. Here's something I learned during that time that I want you to know. About 5% of seniors suffer physical abuse, but the emotional and financial manipulation, that's often invisible. Nobody sees the slow erosion of your autonomy. Nobody notices when you stop making decisions for yourself because someone else has convinced you that you're not capable. But it's abuse all the same. And the first step to breaking free is recognizing it for what it is. Carol helped me see that. She helped me understand that my feelings weren't an overreaction. They were a survival instinct, telling me to protect myself before there was nothing left to protect. The conversation with Marcus was excruciating. He came over with Vanessa, which I should have expected but somehow didn't. They sat on my couch, the same couch where I'd rocked him as a baby, and demanded to know what was going on. Why had I cut off their access to my accounts? Why was I being so difficult right before the wedding? Vanessa's voice had lost its sugary coating. She was angry, and she didn't bother hiding it. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and tried to find the boy I'd raised. But all I saw was a man who'd been shaped by someone else's hands, someone who valued peace over truth, comfort over courage. I told them, as calmly as I could, that I was done being treated like an inconvenience, that I deserved respect, not tolerance, that my help wasn't a given, it was a gift, and gifts could be withdrawn. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, indignation, anger. He started to argue, to tell me I was being unreasonable, but I cut him off. I'd spent months swallowing my words, and I wasn't doing it anymore. I told him about the nickname, about the dinner party, about every small cruelty that had chipped away at my sense of self. I told him how his silence had hurt more than Vanessa's words ever could. And I told him that until he was ready to treat me like a person instead of an obstacle, I needed space. "Mom, you're blowing this way out of proportion," he said. And that's when I knew he truly didn't understand. He thought I was being dramatic, emotional, all the words people use to dismiss women's legitimate pain. I looked him in the eye and said, "I raised you to be better than this. Your father raised you to be better than this. If you can't see how you've hurt me, then you're not the man I thought you were." His face crumbled for just a second, a flash of the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But then Vanessa touched his arm, and the mask came back up. "This is exactly what I was talking about," she said to him, not even looking at me. "The guilt trips, the manipulation." My hands clenched into fists under the table. "I'm not manipulating anyone," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I'm setting a boundary. There's a difference." Vanessa tried to interrupt, to spin it into something else, but I held up my hand. "This is between me and my son," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt like myself. They left without another word, and I sat in the silence of my house and cried. But they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life. Marcus didn't call. Vanessa didn't text. It was like I'd been excommunicated from the family I'd built. But Carol was there. And slowly, other people started showing up too. Old friends who'd heard through the grapevine that I was back in circulation. Neighbors who invited me to block parties and potlucks. I started volunteering at the community center, helping with literacy programs for kids. It gave me purpose, a reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with Marcus or Vanessa or the wedding I was no longer involved in. I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Working with the kids was unexpectedly healing. Most of them were from immigrant families, their parents working multiple jobs and trying to build better lives for their children. I'd sit with a 7-year-old named Sophia, helping her sound out words in her reading book, and I'd feel useful in a way I hadn't in months. These children needed me. They didn't care that I was old-fashioned or slow. They just cared that I showed up every week, patient and encouraging, celebrating their victories and helping them through their struggles. One afternoon, Sophia finished a particularly difficult book and threw her arms around me. "Thank you, Miss Linda," she said, beaming. I felt tears prick my eyes. "You're welcome, sweetheart," I managed. And I realized that this simple gratitude from a child I'd helped meant more to me than all of Vanessa's backhanded compliments and Marcus's distracted appreciation ever had. There's a survey from 2009 that found 9% of seniors suffer verbal or psychological abuse. When I read that statistic, it was like someone had turned on a light in a dark room. I wasn't alone. This thing that had happened to me, this quiet dismantling of my dignity, it had a name. And there were resources, support groups, legal protections I didn't even know existed. Carol helped me connect with a local advocacy group, and just knowing there were people who understood, who believed me, who didn't tell me I was overreacting, that was everything. It didn't fix the hurt, but it made it bearable. It reminded me that I had value, even if my own son couldn't see it. I also started going to therapy. I know. I'm from a generation that didn't really do that. We handled our problems privately, kept our pain to ourselves. But my therapist, a woman named Dr. Patel, helped me untangle the web of guilt and obligation I'd been trapped in. She helped me see that loving someone doesn't mean letting them hurt you, that boundaries aren't punishments, they're acts of self-preservation, that I deserved to take up space in my own life. It sounds so obvious when I say it out loud, but it was revolutionary to me. For the first time in years, I started to believe that my needs mattered as much as anyone else's. Dr. Patel had this way of asking questions that forced me to confront truths I'd been avoiding. In one session, she asked, "What do you think you were trying to earn with all those sacrifices?" I'd stammered something about love, about family, about being a good mother. She'd nodded thoughtfully and said, "But you already are Marcus's mother. You already love him. So what were you really trying to earn?" And that's when it hit me. I was trying to earn the right to exist in his life. I'd internalized the message that my presence was conditional, that I had to constantly prove my worth or be discarded. That belief had shaped every interaction, every decision, every time I'd swallowed my hurt to keep the peace. Dr. Patel helped me see that love shouldn't require that kind of constant audition. Real love makes space for you just as you are. The confrontation, the real one, didn't happen in private. It happened at the annual neighborhood block party, an event I'd almost skipped because I didn't want to deal with the questions or the pity. But Carol convinced me to go, and I'm glad she did. Because Marcus and Vanessa were there, holding court with their friends, showing off Vanessa's ring and talking about the wedding like it was the social event of the century. I watched them from across the street, and I felt that old familiar ache, the longing for things to go back to how they were. But then I remembered the dinner party, the nickname, the silence, and the ache turned into something harder. Resolve. I waited until they were surrounded by people, their audience assembled, and then I walked over. The conversation stopped when they saw me. Vanessa's smile faltered. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just spoke, clearly and calmly, so everyone could hear. I told them about the financial support I'd been providing, the thousands of dollars I'd poured into their lives while they mocked me behind my back. I told them about the nickname, about Vanessa's constant digs at my traditions, about Marcus's refusal to defend me. I told them that I was done being their ATM and their punching bag, and I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me moving forward, it would be on terms of mutual respect or not at all. The whole block went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Vanessa tried to laugh it off, to make it seem like I was being dramatic, but her voice cracked, and people noticed. Marcus stared at the ground, his face the color of a stoplight. And then something unexpected happened. One of the older neighbors, a man named Frank who'd known me for years, stepped forward and said, "Linda's right. I've seen how you treat her, and it's not okay." Another neighbor chimed in, then another. Suddenly, the narrative Vanessa had worked so hard to build, the one where I was the problem, started to crumble. People who'd been at that dinner party, who'd laughed at her jokes, were looking at her differently now, seeing her not as the charming young woman navigating a difficult mother-in-law, but as someone who'd been systematically cruel. Marcus finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in months. Shame. Real, genuine shame. He opened his mouth to say something, but I shook my head. "I don't need your apology right now," I told him. "I need you to think about the kind of man you want to be." And then I walked away. Carol met me halfway across the street, and we went back to my house and ate ice cream straight from the carton. It wasn't a victory, not really. It was just the truth, finally spoken out loud, and that was enough. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Vanessa's friends started distancing themselves, uncomfortable with the public confrontation and the questions it raised about her character. Marcus's extended family, aunts and uncles who'd been at that dinner party, reached out to me with apologies and offers of support. Some of them admitted they'd noticed the dynamic, but hadn't known how to address it. Their validation meant more than I can express. It told me that I hadn't imagined it, that my pain was real and witnessed. Vanessa tried to control the narrative, posting vague things on social media about toxic family members and moving forward, but it didn't stick. Too many people had seen the truth firsthand. Her reputation, the one she'd built on charm and manipulation, started to crack. Marcus showed up at my door a week later, alone. He looked awful, exhausted and hollowed out, like he'd been forced to reckon with something he didn't want to see. We sat on the patio, the same place where I'd cried after the engagement party, and he told me that the engagement was off. Vanessa had shown her true colors in the aftermath of the block party, lashing out at him for not defending her, blaming him for my behavior. He'd finally seen what I'd been trying to tell him all along, that she didn't love him. She loved what he represented, the stability, the family, the resources. And when those were threatened, her mask slipped. He was devastated, but also relieved. Like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't realize was crushing him until it was lifted. He apologized. Not a surface-level sorry, but a real, bone-deep acknowledgement of how he'd failed me. He told me he'd been so desperate to build a life separate from his grief over his father, from the pressure of being my everything, that he'd latched onto Vanessa's vision without questioning it. He'd let her rewrite our history because it was easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth that he'd been complicit in my erasure. I listened, and I forgave him. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because I could see that he was genuinely trying to understand what he'd done and who he wanted to be moving forward. But I also told him that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. That rebuilding trust would take time, and he'd have to prove through his actions that he meant what he said. We talked for hours that day, the kind of deep, honest conversation we hadn't had in years. He asked me about the therapy, about the advocacy group, about all the pieces of my life he'd stopped paying attention to. I told him about Sophia and the literacy program, about the book club, about how I was learning to be Linda again instead of just his mother. He listened, really listened, and I could see him processing the reality of how much I'd been struggling, how much he'd missed. At one point, he said, "I don't know how I let it get this bad." And I told him the truth. Because you stopped seeing me as a person, I became a role, a function. And when Vanessa offered you a life where that function wasn't needed, you took it without looking back. He flinched, but he didn't argue. He knew I was right. The wedding was called off. Vanessa moved out of Marcus's apartment and back to wherever she came from, and honestly, I didn't care enough to keep track. She'd lost her foothold in our family, and that was justice enough for me. Marcus started coming around more, but it was different now. He didn't just show up when he needed something. He asked about my day, my volunteering, my friends. He listened when I talked, really listened, instead of waiting for his turn to speak. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, conversations where we had to navigate the hurt that still lingered. But it was real. And real, I was learning, was worth more than perfect. One Sunday, Marcus showed up with groceries and suggested we cook together, something we hadn't done since he was in high school. We made his father's favorite chili recipe, the one that required hours of simmering and constant tasting. As we chopped onions and argued about the right amount of cumin, I felt something shift. This was my son, not the man Vanessa had molded him into, but the boy I'd raised. The one who'd inherited his father's sense of humor and my stubborn streak. He was finding his way back, and I was letting him, but on my terms this time. With boundaries in place and the understanding that respect was non-negotiable. When we sat down to eat, he raised his water glass and said, "To new beginnings." I clinked my glass against his. "To truth," I corrected, and he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "To truth," he agreed. I also started to reclaim pieces of my life I'd abandoned. I rejoined my book club, started going to church again, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I even took a pottery class, something I'd always been curious about but never made time for. Turns out, I'm terrible at pottery. My bowls are lopsided and my vases look like drunken cylinders, but it doesn't matter. The point isn't to be good at it. The point is to do something just for me because it brings me joy. That's a concept I'd forgotten somewhere along the way. That my happiness didn't have to be earned or justified. It could just exist, simple and uncomplicated. Carol and I became closer than ever. She was there through all of it, the confrontation, the fallout, the slow rebuilding, and she never once said "I told you so," even though she absolutely could have. Instead, she celebrated every small victory with me. Every time I set a boundary. Every time I chose myself over someone else's comfort. She reminded me that I was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the person you have to fight is yourself. Your own doubts, your own guilt, your own internalized belief that you don't deserve better. She taught me that reclaiming your life after it's been taken from you isn't a single dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small choices made every day to show up for yourself the way you've always shown up for others. Looking back now, I can see that the nickname was never really about me being slow. It was about making me small, about reducing me to something easily dismissed. But I'm not Turtle anymore. I'm Linda. A woman who survived being erased and came out the other side stronger. A woman who learned that love without respect is just another form of control. A woman who knows her worth and won't settle for less. That's who I am now. And honestly, I like her a whole lot more than the woman I was before. Before I close this chapter of my story, I want to share something important I learned through all of this. Something that might help you if you're going through something similar or know someone who is. What happened to me has a name. It's called coercive control, and it's a form of abuse that doesn't leave physical marks, but can be just as devastating. I didn't know that term when I was living through it. I just knew that I felt smaller and smaller, like I was disappearing even though I was still breathing. Coercive control is about systematically undermining someone's sense of self, isolating them, and making them doubt their own reality. It can happen in romantic relationships, but it can also happen in families, between parents and adult children, between in-laws. One of the biggest warning signs is isolation. If someone in your life is slowly cutting you off from your friends, your community, your support system, pay attention. It might seem like they're just prioritizing family or being practical, but isolation is a tactic. It makes you dependent on them for validation and connection, which gives them power over you. Another warning sign is the erosion of your decision-making. If you find yourself constantly second-guessing your own judgment, asking permission for things you used to decide on your own, or feeling like you need someone else's approval to exist, that's a red flag. You should be able to make choices about your own life without fear of ridicule or retaliation. Financial control is another huge one. If someone is pressuring you to give them access to your money, making you feel guilty for not sharing your resources, or using your financial support as leverage to control your behavior, that's abuse. Your money is yours. You have every right to set boundaries around it, and anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to manipulate you. I didn't understand that until Carol helped me restructure my finances. I thought being a good mother meant giving everything, including my financial security. But that's not love. That's exploitation. If you're in a situation like this, please know that it's not your fault. These dynamics are designed to make you feel crazy, like you're the problem. They rely on your good intentions, your desire to keep the peace, your belief that love should be unconditional. But love is not the same as doormat. You can love someone and still protect yourself. You can set boundaries and still be kind. And you can walk away from a toxic situation and still be a good person. In fact, walking away might be the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for the people who are hurting you. Because sometimes people don't change until they face real consequences. There are resources out there if you need help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline isn't just for physical abuse. They can help you understand what you're experiencing and connect you with local support. There are also advocacy groups specifically for elder abuse. Because yes, what I went through counts as elder abuse, even though it wasn't physical. And there are therapists who specialize in family dynamics and coercive control. You don't have to navigate this alone. I thought I did, and it almost broke me. But once I reached out, once I let people in, everything changed. So please, if any part of my story resonates with you, reach out. Talk to someone. You deserve to be heard and believed and supported. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I know this was a lot, and I appreciate you being here. Before you go, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Drop it in the comments. And if this story connected with you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in my experience, please hit that like button. It helps more people find this channel, and you never know who might need to hear that they're not alone. I also want to ask you something that's been on my mind. What would you have done in my place? Would you have confronted them publicly like I did, or would you have handled it differently? There's no right answer, but I'm curious about your perspective. Let me know in the comments. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. This channel is about real stories from real people navigating messy, complicated family situations. It's about finding strength when you feel weakest and reclaiming your life when someone else has tried to take it from you. And it's about building a community where we can support each other through the hard stuff. You're not just subscribing to a channel, you're joining a tribe of survivors who refuse to be silenced. I also want to recommend a couple of other videos that might resonate with you. There's one about a woman who discovered her husband's secret family, and another about a daughter who had to set boundaries with a manipulative parent. Both of those stories have elements that echo mine, and I think you'll find them just as powerful. Check them out when you get a chance. And finally, I want to leave you with this. Your life is yours, not your children's, not your partner's, not your family's. Yours. You get to decide what you tolerate and what you don't. You get to set boundaries. You get to say no. You get to choose yourself without guilt or apology. I spent so long forgetting that, and it cost me years of my life. But I remember now.